Good morning, anatomy class. I wanted to get at least one of these videos done before we had our review session today. And so I'm going to focus this morning in on the anatomy of the respiratory system. Again, like all of these systems, we primarily study the anatomy when we're in lab, and I'll try to point out a few things that we will be working on following your lab practical the following week in regards to the respiratory system. But it's also good to make sure you know these structures. One, right, to be able to have a conversation with someone. If a doctor's telling you something, you know where that location is. But then also, again, anatomy and physiology go together, right? Form follows function. So if we can understand these structures, we're more likely to understand the physiology, which, by the way, is way cooler. We're going to get into some really neat stuff as we look at the respiratory system. So before we dive into the specifics, think about the overall function of the respiratory system, right? So I would say primarily, right, it's doing a few things. It's giving us a surface area for gas exchange to take place on, right? In the lungs, we have this huge surface area. It's something like if you laid the alveoli out, it would be something like a tennis court, right? So huge surface area for gas exchange. We definitely have a lot of structures that are going to help us move air to and from that respiratory surface. We also have some components that are going to help us to protect the respiratory surface, whether that's from dryness or temperature or pathogens. So we'll look at that. It does help us produce the sound for communication, right? So you have to be able to, some of the structures, right? Things like your vocal folds, plus the pushing of the air across that. So we'll see a component here of making those sounds for communication. Olfaction, technically part of the nervous system, but the respiratory system is going to facilitate that, right? So the olfactory or the smell receptors are located in the nasal passage. We'll also see that the lungs do produce ACE. Remember we talked about angiotensin converting enzyme, which is super important in that RAS system. So it does help maintain blood pressure. Well, ACE is found in the lungs. And so you could kind of put that probably secondarily down on the list, but it's there. Okay, so again, most of this anatomy we'll do in lab, but let's take a quick look here, right? So one of the key things that you should notice, right, is that we separate the respiratory system into the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. So in the upper respiratory system, you're looking at things like the nose, the nasal cavity, which of course is all that space. Where's my pointer? This space posterior to the nose. The sinuses would be included as part of the upper respiratory system, and then the pharynx, right, which is the throat. So we will look at the regions of the pharynx as well. Basically, your line of division here is going to be right at the larynx, right? So the epiglottis is this flapper that's going to go down and close the trachea to keep food from getting in. And that's kind of the cutoff point here between upper respiratory tract and lower. So then in the lower respiratory tract, we would include the larynx. That's your Adam's apple. That's where your vocal cords are, your voice box is. Right, so that's the larynx. The trachea, of course, our big tube that's going to be conducting air. And then the trachea start to branch, right? So we see this, where's my pointer? There it is. Okay, the trachea branches into two bronchi, right? And we'll look at that in a little more detail. You start going like primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi. We eventually end up in small divisions called bronchioles, right there, and eventually the air sacs, the alveoli, right? And those are all components of that lower respiratory tract. That's the image from your book, trying to point out the same thing, but the larynx is definitely in the lower respiratory tract. Again, it's all connected. It probably doesn't matter, but that's actually how I remember the cutoff point, right? L, larynx, lower. Okay. Um, So I did want to kind of zoom in just a smidge here, because we find out a few important things about these regions. And again, we'll mostly do this in class. So a couple things to point out here. So when we get into the nasal cavity, it seems a little weird, right? Like when you see this picture and you're like, wait, there's like all that space behind my nose. Like, what is that even for? So again, structure and function go together. So notice what you have here. You have these huge ridges on both lateral sides of this nasal cavity. And you should recognize the nasal concha, or sometimes called turbinate bones, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. You should actually recognize those from A&P1 when you learned all the parts of the skull. So what ends up happening here in the nasal cavity, these concha, I think I have a better, that's the picture from your book 23-2. This is the weirdest picture ever, but right, this is a frontal plane of an actual human skull. And I only include it because you can actually see these nasal concha, superior, middle, and inferior, right? And check out, here's a sinus, right? This big cavity. Again, and there's another sinus, there's the eyes, here's the oral cavity, the mouth. So in that nasal cavity, it's not just a big opening, it's filled with these concha. And what ends up happening is these are, of course, all covered in a mucous membrane. So this is a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, right? And if you remember, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, it's going to be really good at producing mucus, and it has cilia. And so both mucus and cilia are going to be able to help us trap pathogens here in the nasal cavity, and even larger things, dust and stuff like that. The other thing that happens, the nasal cavity, if you think about its main function, it's actually to warm and moisten that air. We live in a great place to think about this, right? In the middle of winter, when it's -20, there's like 0% humidity, right? And the air is super cold. If that went directly onto those alveoli, you would damage the respiratory surface, you would damage the lungs. And so what we're doing is we're trying to warm and humidify the air in the nasal cavity. These nasal concha just end up acting as a huge surface area to cover with that epithelium that's going to be carrying a rich blood supply to help warm the air, and again, all that mucus to help humidify it, right? So again, this picture is like super freaky, but I think does a really nice job of showing what we actually have going on there in the nasal cavity, right? So big picture, if you think about respiratory epithelium, let's take a look at how this changes. So the respiratory epithelium, right, it's really about conditioning the air before it gets to the alveoli. So again, filtering it, warming it, moistening it. We're going to see it change throughout this system, and that has to do, of course, with its function in each of those places. If you recall, a mucous membrane, or the mucosa, is always going to include an epithelium and then an underlying connective tissue. In this case, it's always areolar connective tissue, right? You've got this layer that has lots of mucus glands and then also a little bit of smooth muscle in it as well. So they call this the lamina propria, this underlying layer. It's primarily areolar connective tissue, but again, lots of mucus glands and also some smooth muscle. The epithelium is going to change from region to region. So again, we said, let's just run down here. Oop. So again, in this nasal cavity, we are looking at a pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. In the pharynx, right, so here's the pharynx, this is the throat, right? This is the back of the mouth. Since food is entering here, we need something that's a little more protective. So we're actually going to find a stratified squamous epithelium. I always joke, right, like you need to protect yourself from tortilla chips. So this is a much tougher epithelium. Once you move past this shared passageway for food and air, right, and we actually enter the larynx, we don't have to be near as careful, right? We're not expecting, hopefully, food to end up in the larynx. And so what we're going to start to see then is this shift back to pseudostratified ciliated columnar. That's what we'll actually see in the larynx, down into the trachea, and even into the bronchi. Again, lots of mucus and cilia. Again, we're trying to trap microbes, and then we use the cilia to actually propel them back out of the trachea. Finally then, well, I guess not finally, when we branch down into the bronchioles, so those even smaller, oh, that was the picture I was looking for earlier. There's your pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Again, we would find this throughout the nasal cavity and the trachea. But then once we move on, I'm sorry, I'm just like flipping through pictures here. It's early. There we go. When we get into these bronchioles, these much smaller tubes inside of the lung, you're looking more at a cuboidal epithelium. And then in the alveoli, what kind of epithelium would you want for gas exchange to take place across the alveoli? If you said simple squamous epithelium, you're correct, right? The thinnest possible cell to improve gas exchange. So again, big picture, nasal cavity, right? And what we would call the conducting system, the trachea and the bronchi. Think about pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Okay, we do need stratified squamous epithelium in the pharynx because we have a shared passageway, and then in the alveoli we need simple squamous epithelium for that gas exchange. So if you think about the function, hopefully that'll help spring to memory some of those different tissue types that you learned in A&P 1. Okay, I'm going to pause. Sorry, so I paused while I scrolled through there. So continuing down the respiratory system, we get to the larynx. We will in lab go through all these different cartilages, but I did just want to point out here, right, the larynx, and you can find that by finding the thyroid cartilage. We would call that the Adam's apple, but that's the big cartilage. But inside here, we have the vestibular fold, and then also the vocal fold. So we have two main folds here. Of course, the vocal fold is the one that we would call the vocal cord, right? And as you adjust the stretch or the contraction, it's a muscle. As you adjust that, you are going to be able to adjust kind of the pitch of your voice, right? So you can actually make your voice much higher by changing the muscles there. Right, and so then that's the view kind of looking down, right? If you put a scope down someone's into their larynx, right, you'd actually be able to see those vocal folds. So again, air has to kind of squeeze between them, and so you can change the pitch on how tight those are. Okay, moving on. So down into the trachea, this is a nice cross section, right? So we can, if you zoomed in closer, we would actually be able to see this tracheal cartilage. It's actually a hyoid, hyaline cartilage that you would recognize. And then if we zoomed in again, we would see that pseudostratified ciliated epithelium, right, lining the trachea. Really the trachea, this whole portion, right, is really this conducting system. We're just trying to get air to the lungs, hopefully get some of the microbes out of it before it gets there. So do notice, right, this splits into primary bronchi and then again into secondary bronchi, and it will also go into tertiary bronchi. That's your book's picture. Before we eventually branch down into these bronchioles. Bronchioles are the smallest tubes, and they're going to deliver air to the alveoli. The bronchioles are really important, right, because they're trying to show in this picture, they have a lot of smooth muscle around them. And so it's these bronchioles that actually change in diameter to change the airflow and the distribution of that air in the lungs. We'll see that distribution of air in the lungs is meant to match the perfusion, the blood flow. So you want to send blood and then oxygen to the same regions of the lung. And so that can be adjusted by the diameter of these. We'll see that the sympathetic nervous system actually causes bronchodilation, right? And if you think about fight or flight response, that makes sense. We want to improve the oxygenation of our blood. So sympathetic nervous system does bronchodilation, and then the parasympathetic nervous system is going to do bronchoconstriction. Okay, so make sure you keep those straight. Okay, and then we finally arrive to the part that's really cool, the alveoli. This is where the actual gas exchange is going to take place. You have something like 150 million alveoli per lung, right? And you can see, again, in this image, they're trying to show that the alveoli are really covered in this dense capillary network. And then there's also a lot of elastic fibers. One of the really important things about the lung, right, is you can get it to expand, but then it recoils. And so those elastic fibers are going to make sure the lungs bounce back. That's going to be really important in expiration. Okay, let's look here at the alveoli. And so what you're going to see, the majority of the cells, these light purple ones in here, those are your simple squamous epithelium. This is where diffusion takes place. In the lungs, we refer to those as a pneumocyte type 1. So anytime you see that prefix pneumo, like pneumonia, pneumothorax, it should be making you think lung. And of course, cyte means cell. So pneumocyte type 1, lung cell type 1. This is really just for the diffusion of gases. And that's your primary cell there, right? Because that's the role. We do have a couple cells that are a little different. So here we see this cell. This is called a pneumocyte type 2. And type 2 pneumocytes are important as well, though way less numerous. They produce surfactant. So surfactant is really meant to decrease surface tension. So you put, one place you would find surfactant maybe in your daily life is actually in detergents. So surfactants break surface tension. So think about you're at home, you can try this. Put a little bit of water in a plastic baggie, right? And then when you close it, it's going to be hard to like pull it apart, right? The water, that thin film of water kind of glues the sides of the bag together, right? That would happen in the alveoli as well, right? They're microscopic. They have to be kept moist for gas exchange to go well. And so they would want to stick together. Go ahead and take that plastic baggie, add a little bit of soap, right? And now you should be able to pull the sides apart easier. That's what surfactant does. It decreases the surface tension. So it's important to keep our alveoli from snapping shut and staying there, right? From our lung collapsing and not being able to expand again. Okay. We also in here have cells called alveolar macrophages, right? And it's just another macrophage. Sometimes you'll hear them called dust cells. So these macrophages are just like roaming around on the surface of the alveoli, looking for pathogens, looking for bad guys. So we just got finished talking about macrophages. So you should be good there. Okay. So then, again, this is the image from your book showing the same thing, type 1 pneumocyte, type 2 pneumocytes, and then those alveolar macrophages. But what I really liked this picture for is it points out what components of the alveoli, right, of the lung, actually are part of what we call the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is where, as you'll see here, we need to get oxygen across into the bloodstream, into the red blood cell, and then CO2 out and back into the alveolus. Alveolus is singular, alveoli is plural. And so this respiratory membrane, notice what we include here. So there is where is my mouse? There we go. There is a thin layer of fluid that's going to be in the inside of the lung, right? And that's actually going to be useful in gas exchange. And then we have to get through that simple squamous epithelial cell, right? So this is the alveolar epithelium. Between at the base of every epithelial cell, we always have a basement membrane, right? That's always some connective tissue. And so we do have to get through that basement membrane of the alveolar epithelium. Okay. We then have a little bit of interstitial space, right? Intercellular space, interstitial space. Then we have the basement membrane of the capillary epithelium, and then the capillary epithelium itself, which is another simple squamous cell. We've called that endothelium, right? Specifically. So really, you've got the alveolar epithelium, the capillary epithelium, both of their basement membranes, and that little bit of interstitial space there. So this makes for a really short distance for diffusion. It ends up being something like 0.5 micrometers, which to write a little micrometers to put in that to put that into perspective, that's like 5/1000ths of a millimeter. This is a tiny distance, and so that's going to be really important for gas exchange. When we don't jump into the physiology, you'll want to be watching that respiratory membrane for changes. Anything that might thicken that, make that distance larger, is going to make it more difficult for gas exchange to take place. Okay, last thing I'll say anatomically, and then we'll be kind of getting into more of the physiology, is to also think about that blood supply, right? So as we're looking at this blood that's feeding the lung, remember we're in the pulmonary circuit here, right? So those pulmonary arteries, we're bringing deoxygenated blood to the lung, right? This is a very low pressure portion of the circuit. It's easily clogged, it's easily blocked, right? It's not like a fire hose blasting things through here. It's low pressure. And so this is why you get things like a pulmonary embolism. You could get a blood clot forming here in the lungs. That would lead to extra strain on the right ventricle, congestive heart failure, etc. Right? But again, pulmonary arteries bringing deoxygenated blood to the lungs. You actually have a separate systemic circuit. So like off of the aorta, right, you would have branches coming to the lung to actually give oxygen to the lung tissue itself, right? Not this epithelium, they'll just get oxygen from the air, but right, they still need nutrients, and then all the other cells, all that elastic fiber, connective tissue, smooth muscle cells, all of those, they need oxygen, they need nutrients. And so there's actually a separate systemic circulation that feeds the lung tissue as well. Okay, let's end it there on anatomy, and we'll do physiology in the next video.